everyone, my name is Yuliia and you're watching New Multicultural's Community Hour. In this segment, we are talking about civic issues in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Canada is home to 1.4 million people of Ukrainian descent, the world's second largest Ukrainian diaspora, comprising nearly 4% of the population and making them the largest Slavic group in Canada. Ukrainian immigrants and their descendants have left a profound mark on the development of Canada. How did this happen, and what does it mean for Canada itself? In this and other questions, Dr. Stella Hryniuk will help sort things out in today's interview. Dr. Stella Hryniuk is a professor of history in the history of Ukrainians in Canada. She is one of the pioneer historians who established the field of the study of Ukrainians in Canada and had an important role in the founding of the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies. Hello, Dr. Stella Hryniuk. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Hello, Yuliia. It's a delight. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. Thank you for inviting me.
So let's start with the key question. How did this happen that Canada became a home for the second largest Ukrainian diaspora in the world? What are the historical reasons for immigration of Ukrainians in Canada?
There are many, but in a word, I think we could say that Canada was very attractive to all the immigration waves. From the first one, which came in the 1890s and the early 1900s, people were seeking land. The land shortage in Europe for people there, Ukrainians, was fulfilled by coming to Canada. They had a good promise of land. And then after many hundreds of, let's say 170,000 came in that first wave, then there was a second wave in the 1920s and 30s who were often relatives and friends and neighbors from the first wave, also coming because of poverty and economic difficulties mostly under Polish rule in Poland. And then after the Second World War, there was a large immigration, not as large as the first two, of people who were refugees and displaced people from Ukraine who found themselves in the war zones after the Second World War. So Canada offered protection and refuge, as it's doing again now.
There were a lot of different waves of immigrants, Ukrainians to Canada, and now we see another wave, the new wave of immigrants, Ukrainians to Canada. What is the difference between previous waves and now? Probably
the most important thing is that the people coming now are truly displaced by tragedy in their homeland. Poverty is not such a big issue, but the war has destroyed parts of the homeland, and the people who are coming are really exiled. They are refugees. The first three waves to some extent, but not like this wave, not at all.
The Ukrainian community has managed to build a solid relationship with the Canadian government. Now we are one of the strongest and influential communities in Canada. What helped Ukrainians to build a solid relationship with the Canadian government?
That's a good question. It started probably in the second wave, and then after the Second World War, Ukrainians became more educated and integrated in Canadian society. They elected their own representatives, starting even in the 1920s, and began to have a voice in the policies of the Canadian government. And especially during the Second World War, there were 500,000. There were Ukrainians all across the country, and they had relatives who were suffering in the homeland. So there began to be an organization of a unified Ukrainian community, which resulted in the creation of something called the Ukrainian Canadian Committee. Now it's called Ukrainian Canadian Congress, which is a lobby group. It is a presence of the Ukrainians in circles of government, its pressure, its influence, so that the Canadian government does not forget that Ukrainians are a large number and have a voice. So this is really what has happened.
Can you tell us more about another ways how Ukrainians influence on the Canadian policy on the multiculturalism?
Yes, that's a question that not many people ask or want really to know. But in the 1960s, I don't want to go into deep history, but there were, the Canadian government was considering changes to the social policy of Canadian society, and there were problems in Quebec. There was something called the Quebec Revolution. Canada was, they were worried about what kind of society we were building. So a large study was made of Canadian culture, and the study resulted in a report which more or less decided, the commission decided that Canada needed a bicultural policy. But Ukrainians were very concerned that being a large force, and also many other ethnic groups, did not have recognition in a bicultural policy. So they spoke out. They actually demonstrated in the 60s and 70s to decide, or to help the government to decide to make a policy which was inclusive of what they called the third element, or the third force, which was the ethnic groups. They had also built Canada. They were not charter groups like the English and the French, but they were significant in numbers, and also had contributed so much to Canada. So then in 1971, the Prime Minister at that time, after, of course, consultation, declared that Canada was a multicultural country. And in time, a policy was created that stated that. In 1988, 89, it became official.
Canada is a multicultural country, and people from all over the world come to Canada. And how did Ukrainians manage to not get lost among other nationalities, and even after several generations, to save their language, their traditions, and their identity?
Yes, it's also important to know. I think Ukrainians are not unique in that they have done that. They have created institutions. They created language schools. They had their own. They had organizations like churches and social clubs where they promoted their own traditions and language. They did that from the very beginning. I would say that for the Ukrainians in particular, the churches were important until perhaps after the 1950s, when bilingual schools were created and other such institutions. Yeah.
What were the key moments, or in other words, the larger historical events that shaped Ukrainians, Canadians?
Of course, each immigration itself has important moments, but I would say that 1914 to 16, when the war was on, this was a time when some Ukrainians had to be, or didn't have to be, but were interned because they were considered enemy aliens in the time of the war, and that shaped their mentality, or their approach perhaps, to the Canadian society. There was discrimination. So that was an important moment. But then I would say the policy of multiculturalism has been an extremely important moment for Ukrainians in Canada. And there have been others, but it's a long history. It's over 100 years. I could name something in almost every decade since 1900 that has shaped Ukrainian presence and their view of themselves and their view of their relationship with Canada as a whole. It's very complicated.
What's the relationship of Ukraine with other nationalities?
Ukrainians with other nationalities?
Yes.
I would say, this is more an opinion, but I think it's fairly informed, that because Ukrainians were an early immigration and were a large immigration and repeated, that they became kind of a leading ethnic group in terms of creating a template for an ethnic group's integration into larger Canadian society. I think they are respected. I think that as a whole, Ukrainians are integrated into all walks of life in Canada. So their relationships with other ethnic groups are good ones. I suppose the only one perhaps we have some difficulties with is just recently, I think, the idea that there are people who are of Russian origin among us. But I think that that is also becoming resolved as we realize all the facts about that.
Now let's talk about the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies. You were one of the pioneers who established the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies. Can you tell us how it is started and what was the impetus for that?
Again, after the policy of multiculturalism was being discussed on the campus of the University of Manitoba, there were already two affiliate colleges to the University of Manitoba, St. Paul's and St. John's. They were both faith-based. One was Catholic and the other was Anglican. And St. Andrew's College, which had been founded in 1946, a Ukrainian college, the Seminary for the Orthodox Church of Canada, put forward the idea that they wanted to be an affiliate in some form like St. Paul's and St. John's. So the discussions began about how to create that affiliation. And there were courses being taught already in Ukrainian Canadian history and politics without that being officially through an affiliate. In 1981, 82, I was one of the early professors of Ukrainian Canadian history. We all were really happy that the university decided that this would be a good thing to do, to affiliate, and the creation of the Center of Ukrainian Canadian Studies was the vehicle of the affiliation. It was the way that it would operate. It would be a place where courses would be offered. It would be a place where programs for the community would be offered, and it made it formal and permanent.
And can you tell us more about programs and courses does the center offer, and what impact do they have on growth and the development of Canadian Ukrainian community?
Yeah. Well, I say, first of all, the courses are the important ones. They are mainly leading to a major in the Bachelor of Ukrainian Canadian Heritage Studies. So you can take a major in that, a minor in both the advanced and the general programs, or as options. That's the major, that's the most prominent offering of courses. Now, the courses are interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, primarily in the Faculty of Arts. That is the program that was established, that was like the trademark, if you like. And then besides that, the programs have consisted of community events, lectures, conferences, even concerts, invitations to speakers over the years. And currently, there are 2 programs that students can participate in also, and the community, called the Book Club, which meets every 2 months. They read a book and discuss it on Zoom. And they also have a program called the Letter of Participation, which a person can receive if they attend events at the center or they are involved with the book club. So this is open to the public, and all the events are open to the public, usually free of charge. The other thing that I think is important to say is the center is very helpful. It's a resource center, really lately for the media. In fact, it's a very prominent center for things that have to do with Ukraine, discussions with media about the war and about Ukraine and Ukrainians and Ukrainian Canadians.
What changes have occurred in the work of your center since the beginning of the war?
The media, for example, have looked for experts to describe something, to discuss something. I can give an example that I was involved in. I was asked by a newspaper in Montreal to tell them about why Ukrainians in Canada were an important part. Really, it was a little bit surprising to me, but there's a high level of perhaps just not a lot of information out about Ukrainians in Canada in a general way. So media has been asking a lot of questions, and the center has been very helpful to media in particular.
Mm-hmm. And what is the role of media in the war?
In Canada?
Yes.
I think media has a role to inform truthfully, factually, about what is Ukraine, who are Ukrainians, how much they can, how much is happening in Ukraine. They need connections with, of course, the bigger press organs, and it is really their responsibility to give good information about Ukrainians and the war. That is it.
Ukrainians did a lot for development of Canada. Why a lot of people do not informed and not know enough about the role of Ukrainians in Canada?
I can't answer that exactly. Perhaps again it will be more opinion, but Ukrainians have been assimilating. They have since the 1980s. I think in 1981 in the census, 85% of Ukrainians in Canada were Canadian born. So when you consider that, they have been educated, they have intermarried in Canada, they have lost their language, they have lost some of their traditions, and gradually assimilation does take away the sort of ethnic identity that was so strong earlier when Ukrainians were born in Ukraine, came here, still tried to and succeeded in preserving their traditions. So, and with the loss of language, you lose things like reading, writing, books, published things don't get disseminated anymore, and we get more left with the visual culture, like dance, like the arts, like food. So that now I would say the Ukrainian identity in Canada is often translated from those different forms of our appearance. We have wonderful dance groups, right? Shumka and Rusalka and others, and everybody knows about pirohe or pierogis as they're called, or they also know about artists who are maybe have a Ukrainian name, but perhaps that's all they know. And it's assimilation. It is what is happening.
Do you see that since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the knowledge and the awareness about Ukrainians in Canada is growing, and more people start to be involved in Ukrainian culture?
Yeah, I think, yes, you know, tragically that it has taken this kind of event to bring Ukraine to the attention of the world, and particularly of Canadians. It's definitely increased the visibility of Ukrainians and Ukrainians in Canada. You hear the word every day. You cannot help but hear something about Ukraine and Ukrainians. Yeah.
Canada is home to 1.4 million people of Ukrainian descent, and many of them has relatives in Ukraine. When thoughts and warnings about a possible outbreak of the full-scale invasion began to spread in Ukraine, nobody believed that such a thing as a war possible in 21st century. How were these rumors treated in Canada? Was the diaspora in Canada ready for a full-scale invasion? And have people in Canada make any plans in case the war does happen?
Yeah, I think February last year, Canadians were like Europeans, I would think. Were saying, yes, it could happen because of the war, the invasion of Crimea. We were aware of the possibility that something like that could happen in a broader scale. I would say that Canadian Ukrainians did not expect the severity, the scale of the war that has occurred. What was the other question you asked me was about how Canadian Ukrainians were prepared. Well, all the time since 100 years ago, Ukrainians have had connections, Canadian Ukrainians, with the homeland, but especially I think that in the last maybe 20 years, maybe since 2008, 2014 especially Canadian Ukrainians have been supporting the military issues in Ukraine, sending medical missions, sending materials, sending even training, a lot of training groups to Ukraine to help them in their battles.
Yeah, the war in the east of Ukraine has been going on since 2014, but the world did not pay much attention to it, and it gained scale. In your opinion, as a historian, was it possible to avoid a full-scale invasion, or was the war in Ukraine inevitable?
Oh, that's a really tough one. As a historian, I need to say that Ukraine is such a plum, it's such a country with so many resources that it has always been invaded every century of time. Ukraine has been invaded, and to say that it was inevitable would be incorrect, but to say that it was definitely possible is more correct. It was possible that it would be invaded. The difference with perhaps the earlier invasion, say, of Crimea, was that, again, nobody expected that in a Europe of today there would be a large-scale war, and that Ukraine would be at the center of it.
What is the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada these days? How can you describe it?
Oh, it's a very exciting mix. I find it very enlightening to see that the older generations are becoming, well, they are gradually leaving us, and the perhaps the second and third generations now are older. They have accepted that they are fully Canadian. They are integrated. They have all the rights that anybody had. They are fully integrated. And the new immigrants are just beginning to taste the ideas of Canadian, the principles, especially the democratic principles of Canada. So it's in flux. It's a diaspora is in motion. It's a very exciting time for them. Yeah.
The Ukrainian Canadian community has such a strong, vibrant, and enduring presence in this country. What must we, as Ukrainians and Canadians, do to stay on the leading edge?
Well, I guess we can learn from the past. We can contribute we can form organizations, because in unity there is strength, you know. So if we continue what the earlier generations did, which was to look after the needs of their generation, but also prepare for a future for their children and grandchildren, kind of a succession for the Ukrainian Canadians to come. And they can do that by perhaps working a little harder on preserving the language, the history, and the traditions. The academic world has a lot to do about that. We need to, I think, produce graduate students, scholars, people who will do the research, teach the stories, not forget them. And I think what the arts are doing now already are performing and presenting, keeping it in the face of all Canadians. That's what I think they need to do.
What are your hopes for the Ukrainian Canadian diaspora, and where do you want to see Ukrainians Canadians in 10 years?
Oh my. Oh, my hopes are that the new wave that we are now receiving will strengthen the Ukrainian Canadian community with their energy and their ideas and their skills and their professionalism, and make Ukrainian Canadians even more involved in the creation of Canadian society, in the continuation of the society that we have built. And I think we can see that happening. My hope is that in 10 years from now, you and your generation will be the leaders of these various organizations that have been and are still here, and you will have formed new ones, and Ukrainian Canadian Congress will exist, so we will have a unified force and also a positive impact on Canadian society.
Thank you so much. I think with that we're going to conclude our today's discussion.
It was my pleasure.
And thank you our audience for joining us today. We hope you enjoy it. If you like the episode, please like, share and subscribe to see our upcoming episodes.